Good evening, everyone. Good evening. We're going to get started. Welcome to tonight's very exciting Free Library of Philadelphia Foundation author event. My name is Daniel Blank, and I'm the Managing Director of Public Programs at the Foundation, where, among other roles, I lead this acclaimed author series. As I've often said, this series is, to my mind, one of this city's great cultural treasures. By bringing authors together with readers, we create a space for exciting conversations, and we make the literary world accessible to the Philadelphia community. Now, just a quick note about tonight's event. Questions for the Q&A will be collected ahead of time. So if you have a question, please write it down on one of the note cards that were distributed as you came in. If you need one of those, just flag down a member of our team, and it will be collected in a little bit. But before we get to tonight's program, and before I introduce our two distinguished speakers, I want to say just a few words about our organization. The Foundation works to expand the Free Library's programming and advance its mission of promoting literacy throughout the Philadelphia region. As a nonprofit, we are reliant upon your support to achieve these goals, so please do consider donating. You can either use the QR code on these handy bookmarks that are distributed outside the auditorium and on the bookseller's table upstairs, or you can donate through our website, freelibrary.org. Tonight we welcome Francis Collins, under whose direction the Human Genome Project produced the first finished sequence of the human DNA instruction book. His contributions to science, medicine, and society have been recognized by the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the National Medal of Science, and the Templeton Prize. From 2009 to 2021, Collins served under 3 presidents as the director of the U.S. National Institutes of Health, the largest supporter of biomedical research in the world. Following a year in the White House as the president's acting science advisor, he oversees a research laboratory as a distinguished investigator in the intramural program of the National Human Genome Research Institute. He also leads a bold administration initiative to eliminate hepatitis B in the United States. Tonight, Dr. Collins will speak to us about his most recent book, The Road to Wisdom, on truth, science, faith, and trust. He will be joined in conversation by Kathleen Hall Jamieson, who is a professor in the Annenberg School for Communication at the University of Pennsylvania and founding director of its Annenberg Public Policy Center. She co-founded factcheck.org and in 2020 received the National Academy of Sciences' highest honor, its Public Welfare Medal, for her, quote, nonpartisan crusade to ensure the integrity of facts in public discourse and development of the science of scientific communication to promote public understanding of complex issues. We are clearly in for a treat tonight. Please join me now in welcoming Francis Collins and Kathleen Hall Jamieson.
I'd like to start out by giving you a quote from this book, The Road to Wisdom on Truth, Science, Faith, and Trust. I hope you have a copy or will get a copy, and we'll get it signed right after this event. And this statement says, I've never encountered a situation where I found my scientific and spiritual worldviews to be in serious conflict. And I'm wondering if the word serious has any special meaning.
Okay, I knew this was not going to be a lot of softballs. Good evening, everybody. Really honored to be here this evening to speak to all of you, and especially to have as my conversation partner the distinguished Professor Kathleen Hall Jamieson, who in my view is the most significant expert in the field of the research on science communication that exists right now in the United States. So it's really an honor to be able to have this conversation with her.
Thank you.
She's taught me a lot about some of the things we may talk about in the course of all of our struggles to try to figure out how we can make sure that truth wins out against an onslaught of all kinds of other messages that are particularly prominent right now in our society, and maybe social media is one of the reasons, but not the only reason. So, okay, back to your question. I'm trying not to dodge it.
I was going to say, I recognize this tactic because I study political communication.
So, yes, have I encountered a circumstance where my faith, I'm a Christian, and my science, I'm a geneticist, a physician, have been in conflict that wasn't quite serious? Well, sure. It all comes down to really what kind of questions does science ask and what kind does faith ask? And do we ever get mixed up about which one is being asked and which tools we should be using to answer them? Mm-hmm. By the way, I did not grow up Christian. I became a Christian at age 27, and we could go into all kinds of reasons about that trajectory, which surprised a lot of people, including me. But basically, I think if you are asking a question about nature, science is the way you're going to get an answer that you can trust. If that happens to be an answer that disagrees with somebody's interpretation of a verse in the Bible, which I also hold in great veneration, then we have to think about, wait a minute, have we made a mistake here in terms of which kind of insight we're using in a particular place? For me, I think a lot of the confusion has rested in the area of origins, that if you want to read Genesis 1 and 2 as a science textbook, then you're going to have a problem because the earth really is not 6,000 years old. It's more like 4.55 billion years old, and that comes from multiple directions in science that are really incontrovertible. But looking at Genesis 1 and 2, as, for instance, St. Augustine did in 400 AD, he would say, let's be careful here that we don't attach to this a particular narrow meaning of what is intended. This has all kinds of significance about who we are and who God is, but it isn't probably supposed to be teaching us things like timetables and events in a particular order. I think if we'd stuck to that, we'd be better off. But I understand that a lot of Christians get really hung up on this because it's presented as a requirement for your faith to be really serious, that those days of creation have to be 24 hours. I don't believe the text intended that. If you read the writing of somebody like John Walton, who's an Old Testament theologian at Wheaton College, he will present you in this wonderful book, The Lost World of Genesis 1, I think a much more accurate understanding of what those words meant to the first audience for whom it was presented. And it is not at all intended to be a literal interpretation. So when those things happen, usually you stand back and you think, if we've found a conflict here, it must be a mistake on our part, because I believe, as the organization BioLogos that I had the privilege of founding and which is now represented here tonight by its president and CEO, Dr. Deb Harsma, God gave us two books, the book of God's words, the Bible, which I read almost every day, and the book of God's works, which is nature. They're both God's books. So how can they be in conflict unless we're having a trouble with the reading?
And let me read a passage from your book. For starters, let's agree there are fundamental questions that science is not capable of answering. Mm-hmm. Why is there something instead of nothing? What is the source of morality? Do good and evil have any real significance, or are these just evolutionary drivers that have been wired? You then go on to say in previous chapters, a little later in the book, in previous chapters we've considered the importance of discerning objective truth, science as a means of discovering truth about nature, and faith as a means of discovering truth about the meaning of life and our calling to be moral creatures. You've told us something very important about life in your genome work. Tell us what you've learned from your genome work that will tell us something about morality and about who we are in our society that might bridge some of these understandings between our faith and our science.
Boy, there's a lot in that question. Let me try to unpack it a little bit. I did have the privilege of leading the Human Genome Project, which was this effort to read out all of the letters of the Human DNA Instruction Book. And when that was proposed back in 1990, it was rather controversial because a lot of scientists thought it was a bad idea. It was not going to be practical. It was going to cost too much money. But some of us believed that was the only way we were really going to begin to get a handle on how hereditary factors play out in various illnesses, how cancer comes about, because cancer happens because of misspellings in DNA. We just had to have this reference sequence of 3 billion letters of the genome. And that involved the toiling of about 2,400 scientists over some 13 years in 6 countries. And it was my job to serve as the field general or the project manager or whatever the right term is to try to be sure everybody was actually working together with their shoulders at the same wheel. So, you couldn't say you finished the human genome if chromosome 16 was a mess. You had to do it all, and you had to get it all done. What emerged from that was this amazing script. 3 billion letters in this language that has only 4 letters in its alphabet. A, C, G, and T is the abbreviation of the chemical bases. And of course, they have to be in the right order to be a genome that somehow is capable of directing the development of a complex organism, a human being, from a single cell. Because you all started that way. You have a brain in between your ears that has 86 billion neurons, each of which has about 1,000 connections. All of that has to be directed by this finite script of 3 billion letters, which is a pretty astounding thing to contemplate. So how did that set with science? I think it's set with science in a pretty dramatic way. We've crossed a bridge. We've spent all of our existence not knowing this, and now we know it. I think historians will have to notice that that was a pretty significant moment. It did have one very significant consequence as far as how we view ourselves, which is we learned just how related we all are. Our DNA, yours and mine, no matter which of you I picked, would be 99.9% the same. And that is indication of the fact we are all part of one family. Science will not support a racial prejudice. We're all derived from a common set of ancestors, maybe about 10 or 20,000 of them that started out in Africa. And we are all Africans. Some of us migrated out of that space, and things happened in terms of our appearance as a result of evolutionary pressures that make us flourish wherever we ended up. But we are all one family, and that feels like a pretty good statement to make when a lot of the tensions down through history between human tribes has been about this issue about those other people. Well, we can't say that anymore. It's just all of us people. But did the genome sequence explain good and evil? It did not for me. You mentioned a little quote there from the book about that. I think when I have an argument with somebody who's really a strict atheist, somebody like Richard Dawkins or Christopher Hitchens, both of whom became friends, I think the argument that they would have to admit is sort of the hardest one to fight back, is this argument about morality. Where do we get the idea, all through history, in every human society that's ever been studied, that there is such a thing as good and there's such a thing as evil? And we're supposed to be the people doing the good things. And when we don't, we make an excuse, which only proves we believe we should be doing the good things. Think about that. C.S. Lewis writes about this brilliantly, of course. Is that just a consequence of some evolutionary pressure that idea of good and evil has helped us survive as individuals or as groups? Well, if you want to go that way, that says it's really just a mirage. There's no such thing. We've been hoodwinked into thinking that morality actually matters. Even the strict atheists have a hard time with that. So if that's not the answer, if there really is something fundamental about goodness or holiness, where does that come from? And for me, when I was struggling with my atheism, trying to figure out what was a more rational approach to the question of God, morality emerged in a very strong way as a pointer, not a proof, but a pointer towards the idea that there is a source of holiness. And it's not evolution. It's something much bigger than that. And that seemed to me to make the greatest sense, a signpost that I was looking for. And a signpost not just to a God who is an amazing physicist and mathematician in terms of creating the universe, but who cared about me and wanted me to have this same motivation in my heart to try to do the right thing, even though I knew how often I failed.
You periodically in the book and in places such as the wonderful op-ed in the Washington Post, which spoke to every family that's ever been concerned about prostate cancer by saying that you were dealing with it. But you mentioned prayer. So you mentioned in an op-ed that in that process you prayed. Mm-hmm. You mentioned in the book that when your friend was dying, you prayed. Mm-hmm. You mentioned that a person who is going through a therapy with CRISPR, and it's experimental therapy, prayed and her prayers were answered. What is the connection between everything that's going on in that body that's getting the treatment, and everything that's going on in your friend as your friend is dying, and everything that's going on in your body as you're going through a prostate cancer experience, and the prayer?
And the prayer.
Is God supposed to come in and change the physiology? What is it that the personal God who cares about you is going to do with the prayer? Other than I will stipulate that prayer is a valuable activity in that you are not focused on yourself alone, etc.
That's right.
But what is the theology underlying this?
Well, we could have a long discourse about that, and if the professors from the divinity school were here, they would all disagree. So what is the actual significance of prayer? People have struggled with that from the very beginning, even though we are called to be people of prayer by all of the faith traditions, and certainly by mine, Christianity. Not only did Jesus pray a lot in himself, he also taught us how to pray. That's what the Lord's Prayer is all about. But for me, mostly, prayer is not trying to manipulate God into doing it my way, because that's probably not a good idea. I think my wisdom is way, way out of the category of being something that God needs to learn from. For me, prayer has often been just trying to get some kind of insight, some kind of conditional understanding of what's going on that seems particularly stressful or heartbreaking. And certainly when I'm praying for somebody like my friend Tim Keller, to whom this book is dedicated, who's dying of pancreatic cancer, I don't expect God to miraculously step in and change everything about his body that's at that point riddled with cancer, but I do pray that it would give him peace about what is happening and a relief from both anxiety and pain. That feels to me like an okay thing to do, but I'm also kind of praying for myself and that I will know how to learn from this, how to be a better friend to him, how to be a better person as far as being wise about my own mortality. It's hard to ignore your mortality when you're looking at somebody who's dying. The prostate cancer that I now have, which was not the kind of thing any of us would have chosen, but I decided to be fairly public about it, so I'm glad to talk about it tonight, and then led to a surgical experience. That was a definite reminder of one's mortality. And I was praying, actually, I'm in a book club about mostly books we read are mostly of the theological sort, and there was a book by Dallas Willard, who's a very well-known writer and pastor, who was always encouraging us to be more disciplined. Not my favorite, but I kind of got it, okay. And at the end of one of the chapters, the suggestion is stop and right now, reflect on what you've just read and pray for a little while about whether there's some insight from this chapter that you might want to know. And I don't usually get those kinds of insights. But that particular moment, this very clear message came to me, not in spoken words, not in something where, I heard it, but I felt it. And the message was sobering, but very real. It was this: don't waste your time. You may not have much left. Wow. Now that was true the day I was born, right? It's true for all of you, regardless if you're 20 or 90. But it was very pointed. And that was just at the point, actually, where I was struggling to figure out, is there something I should be doing to try to insert some kind of useful contribution to what's happened to our society with the way in which we become so polarized and so divided, and where truth itself sometimes has been under threat. Is there something I, as a scientist, a physician, a Christian, could contribute? And I was thinking about writing this book, and that message certainly had an effect on me, and you can see it happened. I won't blame God for it, but it still seemed like there was a significant moment there of recognizing a message. Beyond that, Kathleen, I think prayer is a bit of a mystery. It's supposed to be a mystery. Mm-hmm. It has given me comfort. It has sometimes puzzled me and frustrated me, but it is something I lean on, especially when I don't know what else to do.
The book has a focus on wisdom, truth, science, faith, and trust. Those are powerful ideas. Why those 4, actually those 5? And is there some sense that truth, science, faith, and trust needed to be in that order?
It made a better book that way, but I'm not sure that they necessarily should be considered priority. So yeah, the title of the book is The Road to Wisdom. It's a road that I'm on. I hope you're on it too. I think all of us are. We're trying to gather over the course of our lives information that helps us be wiser than we started out being. It's not a road that goes smoothly. You hit bumps. Sometimes you end up in the ditch. Feels like right now a lot of us are struggling to try to stay on that road. I know I am. And so what's happened there? What are the factors that are getting in the way? First of all, what is wisdom anyway? Read the book of Proverbs. You'll get much better definitions than I can give in the next minute. But basically, wisdom depends on knowledge, but it's more than knowledge. Knowledge doesn't necessarily have a moral foundation. Wisdom needs that. And wisdom also depends on experience, on a more sophisticated kind of judgment in a difficult situation where there's not an obvious answer. Wisdom requires insights, common sense. Think about science fiction characters. Spock was the guy about knowledge. Yoda was the person about wisdom, adding to the knowledge this kind of judgment and insight. So we all, I think, aspire to that. Our society aspires to that. Successful societies depend on wisdom as a way to guide themselves forward. Right now, it feels like some of those connections have gotten really frayed. And thinking about what feeds into wisdom, first of all, truth. Science as a means of ascertaining truth about nature is darned important if we're going to have a wisdom that's not based on somebody's opinion, but actually based on factual information about science and nature and medicine. And then faith. I don't think you can be truly wise without, if you're a person of faith, folding that in there as a means of getting wise information about more transcendental questions like, why am I here and what should I do? And then trust. Trust has gotten in deep trouble. If you look at any of the polls like Gallup does every year, our trust in individuals and institutions has plummeted in the course of the last 7 or 8 years. And some of that is earned, and some of it is manufactured. But we're so skeptical and cynical and pessimistic about organizations and institutions that may have done nothing to deserve that loss of trust. But that's where it is. And if we're going to bring ourselves back to that road to wisdom, we have to figure out who to trust and what are our standards for deciding to grant trust. They seem to have gotten a little bit off kilter, where we may be more inclined to trust somebody who's in our echo chamber than we should, and less inclined to trust somebody outside our echo chamber who's giving us truth that we need to hear. We're so polarized about so many things that it's hard for that trust donation to be given in the ideal way for what's good for us.
You write in the book, the goal of this book is to turn the focus away from hyper-partisan politics and bring it back to the most important sources of wisdom, truth, science, faith, and trust, resting upon a foundation of humility, knowledge, morality, and good judgment. Mm-hmm. In that context of hyper-partisan politics, let me turn to the time in which you and Dr. Fauci were guiding the nation through COVID. Can you take us through, from your perspective, what we should learn from what we as a country and you as a representative of the medical community and a person of faith and science were trying to do in those kinds of moments to help the country come through? And then second part of the question, having learned from that, what would you do differently, if anything, if we were to confront the circumstance again in this hyper-partisan era?
Yeah. Well, it's a great question, and there is a lot we could talk about there in terms of what went right and what went wrong. In January of 2020, we knew something really bad was happening in Wuhan, China, and that it was likely to be something that would not be confined there. And by late January, it was pretty clear this was the pandemic we had feared and tried to plan for, but not really quite known what it would look like. Everybody thought the next pandemic was going to be influenza. This was a coronavirus. Mm-hmm. The scientific community rallied to this challenge in a way that I think is absolutely astounding. Within 48 hours after the sequence of the genome of that virus, SARS-CoV-2, was posted on the internet, the mRNA vaccine that became the Moderna vaccine, had been designed by the investigators at NIH in the Vaccine Research Center. And within 60 days, the first volunteer in a phase 1 trial was being injected with that vaccine. That has never happened before in less than 6 or 8 months. And by the summer, after initial studies showed the vaccine appeared to be safe, it was possible to enroll 30,000 participants in each of the vaccine trials. These were volunteers, these were heroes who basically said, okay, I'll stand up, I'll take a shot. I don't know if I'm getting the vaccine or a dummy shot because it's a 50-50 chance. And the people administering the shot didn't know either. This is called a randomized double-blind trial. It's the only way you can really be sure that the results are not in some way skewed by somebody's hopes about what the answer would be. And then you followed those 30,000 people over the course of 4 months to see who got COVID and who didn't. And there was that night in late November 2020 when the blinding was taken off and you could see almost immediately what the result was. I had prayed about this and worked 100-hour weeks for the entire year, as had all the people around me. And I had hoped maybe we'd end up with a vaccine that was as good as a flu shot, which would be maybe 50% effectiveness. It was 95%. And the side effects for 30,000 people appeared to be almost nothing, other than sore arms and some headaches. We all can relate to that. It was an astounding moment. And I think history will look at this as being one of the most amazing achievements of science, because in 11 months, a vaccine was produced, which had never been done in less than 5 years. That part went well. But along the way, during that year, and then spilling over into 2021, as we began to try to get the vaccines into as many arms as possible, the public was losing confidence in whether the science was trustworthy. And there were reasons for that. The original effort to develop a diagnostic test at CDC fell apart, and we lost time there that we should have really had more data. The recommendations about masking initially, don't worry about it, and then, oh, you better put on the mask. That happened because initially we didn't think healthy people would be spreading the virus, only sick people. And then we found out that's not the way it is with COVID. Healthy people were totally capable of spreading it. So, oh, time to put on the mask. But that didn't get explained in a way that a lot of people saw the change, and it sounded like these guys don't know what they're doing. They're jerking us around. And businesses got closed and schools got closed and people were suffering as a result, and the logic for that wasn't clear. And people in the middle of the country were wondering, why do we have to do the things that maybe are helping New York, but we have almost no cases here, and you're hammering us by ruining our economy and our schools at the same time. And what should have been a moment where we had a common enemy, COVID, instead became a moment where we separated off into different categories, many of them driven by politics, and started pointing fingers at each other about not being the right source of truth. Kathleen, you're the expert in science communication, and I think you would agree that while there were some things that went right, there were a lot that really failed to keep up with what was an increasingly large volume of misinformation and frank disinformation coming from places like social media and cable news, and oftentimes from politicians. And lies spread about 10 times faster than the truth. Lies tend to be things that get you really angry and make you want to sort of send them off to everybody else. And pretty soon it's gone viral, and it's hard for people to realize, hey, there was nothing really behind that. And so we lost badly that battle. I blame myself for some part of this. I was one of those science communicators shoved in front of a camera trying to explain to the public what the current recommendations were. And I did not often enough say, I'm going to give you the best information that we've got right now, but we are so completely inadequate in understanding this pandemic that we might have to change that in a month or so. Don't be surprised. It would be good to say that every time, and we didn't, or at least I didn't. And I regret that. And I do regret that our public health recommendations, they were done in such an emergency situation. didn't really take much account of the local circumstances. It was sort of one size fits the whole country, and the country is so diverse in so many ways that wasn't a good fit. Part of the problem was we had decimated our public health system in the U.S. in the years before this, so we didn't really have much in the way of expertise in the local community. But it still came across to people as those elitists on the coasts are kind of telling us what to do. And bit by bit, we began to lose their confidence. And the saddest statistic of all of this is by June of 21, anybody who wanted a vaccine could get it for free. But more than 50 million Americans were saying no. Good, honest, wonderful people who had been led to believe by all of this other information that this was not a safe thing for them or their families. If that was just a disagreement about some particular argument about a fact, that would be one thing. But this was an example where that misinformation and that decision to pass up the vaccine had profound consequences. The Kaiser Family Foundation, in a very careful analysis, nonpartisan, independent group, assesses that between June of 21 and March of 22, just 9 or 10 months, 234,000 Americans died unnecessarily, victims of misinformation. Our culture wars killed 234,000 people. It's hard for me to get my head around how that could have happened in this most technologically advanced country in the world, and yet there it was. And if you needed an indication about how seriously we had gotten in trouble about our understanding about what is objective truth and how can science be trusted, and where does faith fit, because it was often faith communities that were the most reluctant to take on vaccinations. I'm a white evangelical Christian. That was the group that had the strongest resistance to vaccination. And we had lost our ability to figure out who to trust. And trust had been placed, in many instances, in voices that didn't deserve it.
Science prides itself on being self-correcting,
Yes.
at putting a culture of critique in place that ensures that there's competition, and as a result, there actually are incentives for people to try to take down other people's findings and to also push forward on their own when they make mistakes, to admit it, which should
Yes.
be rewarded. But bureaucracies aren't necessarily self-correcting. If we have another pandemic tomorrow, how confident are you that NIH and CDC will learn the lessons that you've just articulated and, as a result, deal with it better than they did the last time, recognizing that they did many things well?
Yeah. I think scientifically a lot of lessons were learned. There was even an effort put together in the year or two after the start of COVID to imagine the next pandemic and try to figure out what would it take to respond not just in 11 months but 100 days from the first identification of a pathogen. Whether we could quite achieve that or not, you could argue, but it was possible to lay out a plan where that might be feasible. That would be an indication of how seriously the science was taken. As far as the communication, I'm not sure, Kathleen, that we got as far as we should. You and I have talked about this. It seems like the model where the science communication is just coming from the top. It's just coming from folks maybe at CDC or in Washington who are seen as out of touch by a lot of people with what's really going on, and even targeted as being elitists, a favorite phrase that's applied to people who maybe are just experts, but now they're called elitists. We got to figure out a way to have the science communication much more distributed, having experts in every community who are well supplied with information, but who people know and are more likely to say, yeah, I believe that. The doctors, the health experts, the teachers in the high school, the students who are studying science in school. We need to figure out how to distribute that. You've made a strong case about that, and I've learned from you about that. And there are some examples of that I think have worked pretty well. But to scale it to the whole country, I don't know that we're there yet. But we need to think about that. I mean, here's a thought experiment you probably won't like, but it's one that keeps me awake at night. Suppose this H5N1 that you're reading about, which is now in cattle and in birds, really does undergo some kind of mutation in its capabilities and becomes to the point where it can be passed freely from human to human. And suppose it turns out to be a 1918 kind of influenza that has a mortality rate of 10 or 20%, including for young people. That is not out of the question. And we would do everything possible to quickly get ready for the vaccine and the treatment of that, but for a little while, it might not be there. Anybody who studies public health would say, should that happen, we would have to put in place the strictest kind of way of stopping transmission by lockdowns, by mask enforcement, by closing schools. Otherwise, all kinds of people are going to die who don't need to. But in our country right now, how will that be received? When we are so polarized that even the idea of wearing a mask causes some people's blood pressure to go off the charts, and now you're going to be told it's a mandate? Mandate? Really? It would be the right thing to do, but I think we might have a very hard time implementing that.
You've given a lot of thought to how we can overcome some of our divides. Could you tell us what BioLogos is doing to try to accomplish that end, and also what Braver Angels are trying to accomplish?
Sure. So BioLogos, which I mentioned earlier, is this remarkable organization that brings people together in civil, gracious dialogue to talk about how science and faith can actually be complementary and are in harmony with each other, not in conflict, which has been many times the assumption that people have carried around, an assumption that I think is unjustified. That took a lot of people being willing to set aside their preconceived notions about the conflict and actually listening to each other. This is the theme here in all of these things. We're not very good at that. We sort of come into a situation, especially one that has some emotion attached to it, and if we have a conversation at all with somebody who doesn't agree with us, we're kind of on the defensive. We're maybe not listening that carefully. We're kind of waiting for our moment to jump in with a snappy rejoinder that sort of tells that person that their view isn't right. That makes almost no headway. If you try to challenge somebody that their view is wrong without having listened to them, they're just going to double down. This is called a backfire effect. That is not the answer. So instead, we really have to adopt this view, as BioLogos did, of having people listen carefully. Where does your perspective come from? What are your sources that you're leaning on in order to draw that conclusion? Braver Angels, an organization I'm also part of, was founded in 2016 to try to deal with the political divisions. And so every Braver Angels gathering is required to have 50% people on the red side and 50% on the blue side. You can't have a meeting without that. And there's a topic. Sometimes it's gun control, or it's immigration, or it's public health. And each side has a chance to state their perspective as bluntly as they want to, but not with personal attacks. And the other side has to listen. Listen so well that you get called on to speak back to that group what you heard them say. Does that sound like marriage counseling? It is kind of marriage counseling for our country. And no surprise, one of the founders of Braver Angels is a marriage counselor. And it's amazing what happens in that setting, because having really listened, you finally have a chance to get a view that this is not just a crazy perspective that somebody has adopted for no reason. You see what the foundation is. And then you begin to talk about that. And somewhere along the way, as you get more comfortable with each other, somebody's willing to say, you know, this is a good conversation because I realize part of the position I've been taking, maybe I'm not quite right about that. And then everything starts to break loose. People are volunteering their willingness to say that they have a need to make a bit of a change. They're not having it forced down their throat. And that's the only way it's going to matter. So Braver Angels has taken on that role. I had a memorable experience having a Braver Angels debate with a trucker from Minnesota named Wilk Wilkinson about public health. And he was very negative about the way in which that was handled. And we had this debate in front of 600 people in the Braver Angels annual convention, which was held symbolically in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. And I started out explaining all the reasons why we tried to do what we tried to do with public health. And then Wilk stepped in a fairly devastating way, explained all the reasons those were wrong. But we kind of knew each other already because we'd had this conversation 4 or 5 times in the preceding year and a half. The session was entitled, "An Elitist and a Deplorable Walk into a Bar."
And which one were you?
Can you guess? Yeah, the government guy who has all the answers. Yes, I'm from the government. I'm here to help. That was me, the elitist. And he was the deplorable. You get the tongue in cheek. You got to laugh about this. Otherwise, it gets even more serious. But that's what we need to do more of. And I think we were trying to model that, and Braver Angels models that. But we got to scale this up. If we're going to have a chance to pull ourselves out of this really difficult situation where we seem to be so at odds with each other, it's not going to come from the politicians. They are more polarized than the country. I don't think it's coming from the media. It's certainly not coming from most of the social media. It's got to come from us. More in Common, a group that started in the UK and now is in the US, has sort of figured out what is the tribal arrangement of the United States. They call it hidden tribes. And they would say, yeah, there's people on the left who are sort of on the fringe, and there are people on the right sort of on the fringe, but most of us are in the middle, the exhausted middle, because we kind of are. It's like just tired of all the animosity, the vitriol, the lack of civility, the unwillingness to actually fact check what somebody just said, but we're sort of tempted to check out. It's up to us, I think, not to check out, but to figure out how to check in and begin to practice initially on a small scale with our friends and neighbors these two things. One, to really reach out to people who you don't agree with and listen to them and begin to understand their perspective and help you understand your own. And secondly, reattach ourselves to the concept that objective truth really matters. It's not okay to have alternative facts. Either you have facts or you don't. You don't have alternative facts. It's not okay to say, well, that might be true for you, but it's not true for me. If it's a fact like the fact that the planet is warming at an unprecedented rate since 1950, by the way, that is another fact that we need to come to grips with and not argue about whether it's really been established. It has been established. The thermometer is not a political measurement.
And I'm going to pause for a moment to ask everyone to pass any questions they have now to the end of an aisle and then forward to me. As I ask, there's a pledge you'd like us to take. What exactly would you like us to take a pledge in order to do?
Well, again, I'm hoping in some way, by conversations like this and by this book, to encourage people not to be despondent, not to be pessimistic, not to be cynical, but to say, we can do something here together. And one way to do that is to not just hear about it, but actually make a commitment, make a pledge, like you do when you got married, or like I did when I started college and I made a pledge to honor the honor code. So here's my proposal, and this is, by the way, if you have a phone and you want to look it up, if you go to Road to Wisdom Pledge on the internet, it'll take you to a site at Braver Angels where this is listed and where you can decide whether you want to sign or think about it. So I'll just read you the words of the pledge and then we'll see what your questions are. I pledge that from this day forward, I will seek to be part of the solution to our society's widespread divisiveness, which is hurting individuals, families, communities, our nation, and our world. I will actively seek out opportunities to engage in dialogue with those who have different views from mine. By respectful listening, I will strive to understand their perspectives better, to identify our shared deeper values, and to build a bridge across the gap that has divided us. When sifting incoming information, I will seek to be a wise consumer. Taking into account my own biases, we all have them, I will carefully assess the plausibility of the claim as well as the integrity, competence, and humility of the source in order to decide whether the information is likely to be trustworthy. I will resist the temptation to speak about, write about, or share on social media information that claims to be true but is of uncertain validity. And I will bring a generous spirit to all my interpersonal interactions, refusing to ascribe evil intentions to others simply because of different political or societal beliefs. I will be slow to take offense. Loving my neighbor will be my goal. Sign here. Please have a look. Again, Road to Wisdom Pledge on the internet will take you to the Braver Angels site where this is posted.
Thank you. I'm going to start trying to consolidate questions, so I won't be using exactly the phrases that you've used. But we have a number of questions that focus on how did you become a Christian? Was your story about coming to Christ? What is the story? Was it because of science or due to science's lack of explanation? Exactly what was it, since you weren't born into the faith tradition but came to it voluntarily as an adult?
Well, I wrote a whole book about this 18 years ago called The Language of God, going through that argument about how I surprised myself by going from atheism to Christian faith. If you go to the BioLogos website, they have a really nice sort of cartoon video that takes 4 minutes, which is a lot better than reading a whole book, so you could look at that at biologos.org. But very quickly, I was challenged by a patient as a medical student to say what I believed because she had shared her faith with me and wanted to know, doctor, what do you believe? And as an atheist, I suddenly realized in front of this good, wonderful woman who was dying of heart disease that I didn't have an answer. I had arrived at atheism because it seemed like that's what other scientists believed, and I didn't really want to think about it. And that forced me to take a journey to try to understand, was there a rational basis for faith? And if so, where would it come from? Some of it came from science, the Big Bang, the fact that the universe is so beautifully ordered mathematically and with physics. But it also led me to begin to contemplate whether not only there was a God who started everything by starting the universe, but who cared about me. And then pointers began to appear that I hadn't thought about. Pointers like beauty. Why do we care about beauty? And pointers like the moral law, which we talked about earlier. I couldn't explain the moral law on a purely naturalistic, materialistic basis. And then I encountered the person of Jesus Christ, who I thought was a myth, and then realized there was more historical evidence for Jesus than virtually anyone else who lived 2,000 years ago, and who not only claimed to be a wise teacher, which he clearly was, and to know the way to God, but claimed to be God, and seemed to demand a decision on my part about whether I was willing to accept that. And I fought that decision for quite a while until ultimately it seemed absolutely compelling. And on a hike in the Cascade Mountains in the northwest of this country on a beautiful day, it became just so clear to me that this is truth to me. I can't prove it, but it's the kind of truth I want to wrap my arms around, and that'll be my foundation for the rest of my life. That was 47 years ago, and that foundation is very much what my life depends on.
I think this question is actually asking whether you had a comparable experience as a result of the Human Genome Project's realizations. Because the person is asking, did you have a sense of awe in the power of our Creator as a result of your understanding that came from that project?
Yes. I think I'm glad for the question. It is a joy to be a scientist who's also a believer. Being a scientist is a joy anyway, because you're kind of like a detective. You search out answers to the way in which nature works. And if you're good at it, once in a while you actually get an answer, although sometimes you go down a blind alley and you don't. And that's satisfying. This is intellectual experience of the highest sort. But if you're also a believer, you're discovering something that God knew already, and you just got a little glimpse of God's mind that nobody had before. That's pretty amazing to contemplate. In that regard, I think the laboratory becomes also a cathedral. And science becomes not just a human activity, but potentially a kind of worship.
Another related question, how do you engage with family members, anyone's family members, including your own, who hold restrictive religious views and view scientific knowledge as undermining their faith?
I want to listen. Again, we'll come back to this. When you have somebody who really disagrees with you, how do you figure out where they're coming from with love and concern and a really willingness to listen, to understand, not to challenge? You can often get to the place where there may be some possibilities there of coming closer together than you thought. But you don't want to force that issue. I had another partner in this that was a very different sort. Christopher Hitchens was this remarkable intellectual who wrote a book called God Is Not Great, one of the more famous atheists of the last 20 years. And he and I got engaged in a couple of debates where he, being an incredibly effective debater, basically wiped the floor with me with the way in which he could both quote all about philosophy, but also about the Bible. He knew the Bible a lot better than many Christians do. And yet it was intriguing. It was this sort of sense of, this is somebody I could learn from. Iron sharpens iron. Maybe I should do more of that. And over time, we became sort of friendly debaters. And then he got cancer, stage 4 esophageal cancer at the first diagnosis, a disease which normally would take your life in a few weeks. It was just at the point where our ability to look at DNA in cancer cells was beginning to potentially shine a light on a better way to decide on treatment. And with my help, he got engaged in a clinical trial, had his cancer cells examined at the most detailed level of the DNA sequence. And what do you know? There was a hint there that one of the mutations that was driving his cancer was one that might respond to a drug that had never been used for esophageal cancer, but had been pretty successful in leukemia. And so he was put on that drug. And I think it helped. It's hard to say. It was an N=1 experiment, which you're not supposed to make much of, and we never quite know what's going to happen with an individual's case of cancer. But he lived a year and a half, and over that time, we spent a lot of time together. And I grew to consider him not just a good debating partner, but a real friend. And I think he grew to appreciate that somebody who loves Jesus and believes in God is not just a stupid idiot, which is the way he would have started, but actually somebody that he was intrigued by, and even at some level was willing to say he could admire. So he moderated his hard edges, and I learned a lot about how he came to his perspective. And when he died, I played a piano song and spoke at his memorial service, which probably surprised a lot of the assembled literary luminaries, most of whom were atheists. Like, what is this scientist doing who's talking about God and playing the piano? But I miss Chris Hitch. I miss him and the way in which he would take apart any kind of claim that was not well-founded and help you see how your argument needed to be stronger. But it was, again, another example. Reach out to those people that you think you have the least in common with. You'll be amazed what you can learn. It's like an experiment in human nature. And those experiments are interesting.
If you don't believe there's an afterlife, which presumably he didn't.
He did not.
Then he gave the theist the last word. But in your eulogy, you posit that there is an afterlife, and as a result, he may have the chance for rejoinder. Do you think that if there's an afterlife, he laughed when he heard that in the eulogy?
I'd love to think he did, and he's capable of laughing. I also think when I see him, that he will tell the whole story about how this happened, and he will tell it really well, because that's the kind of storyteller he was.
I'm going to switch to a dramatically different topic, and only briefly. Do you think COVID came from a lab or naturally?
A lot of people are asking that question, and I understand that. I don't entirely know the answer, because the Chinese have not been forthcoming about the information that we all wish we had about what exactly was going on in the Wuhan Institute of Virology. I will tell you two things. One is that NIH funding had absolutely nothing to do with the origin of this virus, and those who claim that it was have a political agenda that is really hurtful and ought to be a little bit ashamed of themselves to try to take a serious situation like this and turn it into a means of attacking people who were trying to do their best as scientists. I will say that the science basically makes it pretty clear that the original origin of this virus was a natural event. The sequence of the virus was so odd, so unanticipated. It is absolutely nothing that a scientist would have thought could even be infectious. It broke all the rules. So you look at that, it's very hard to say that this was human engineered. I think that can be excluded. All the intelligence agencies would agree. This was not a human engineered virus. And it probably arose in a bat. And then what gets a little fuzzy about what happened after that. Was there an intermediate host, or did it go straight to humans? With other coronaviruses, there's been an intermediate host, a civet cat, for instance, or a camel. We have not proven this intermediate host in this case. Was it possible that this virus was secretly under study at the Wuhan Institute of Virology? I don't know. I can't exclude that. They were clearly doing a lot of research that we didn't know about and don't know about now. And if so, did it get loose accidentally? There's no evidence to support that, but that doesn't mean it can be excluded. Or was this entirely all the way natural, where this bat-derived virus got into an intermediate host, probably a raccoon dog, and was being butchered in one corner of the wet market in Wuhan, And that infected raccoon dog, or maybe many raccoon dogs, ultimately led to the first cases, which all happened in that very corner of that wet market. So the epidemiologists, one of whom published another paper just last week about this, would say the case is pretty compelling, that this was all natural. There are swabs taken early January in 2020 from that wet market where you see DNA from the COVID virus and DNA from a raccoon dog in the same swab. It doesn't prove the virus was in the animal, but it's certainly consistent with that. So where I am right now, I would say, first of all, it was not human engineered. I would give it a 70% kind of estimate that it was entirely natural, and a 30% that it was secretly under study in the Wuhan lab and got loose. And I'm ready to change those percentages if I get new data, which unfortunately is really hard to come by because the Chinese have been absolutely stonewalling about everything that we want to know about.
And we're going to close on an optimistic note.
Oh, good.
Across your lifetime, science has done incredible things, which we forget about because we just take them for granted.
Yeah.
Could you very briefly tell us what you think the 3 most important things that science has contributed to human well-being are across your lifetime, and are you optimistic about what science will contribute in the future, given how fraught this current environment tends to seem to be?
It's hard to narrow it down, but I'll try. First of all, deaths from cardiovascular disease, which used to be, back when I was a young adult, the reason that so many of my friends were losing their fathers and mothers from heart attacks and strokes. Those deaths are down by 70% compared to what they were in the 50s and 60s. And that's a combination of a lot of really careful research about how to manage hypertension and high cholesterol and all those things that we now kind of take for granted. That's a big one. Do you remember when HIV was spreading uncontrollably in the late 1980s? Not just in the gay community, but everywhere. And we had nothing to offer it. And people like Oprah were saying pretty soon our hospitals are going to be just completely overwhelmed with people who have AIDS. The effort that went into finding those antiretroviral drugs in the course of the years that followed that, a wonderful effort between academics and the private sector working together. Tony Fauci had a lot to do with this, and resulting in a circumstance where now somebody who just got diagnosed with HIV at, say, age 20 has essentially a normal lifespan as long as they have access to the drugs. Mm-hmm. That is astounding, and I think we forget sort of exactly how we came through. Now, I would probably want to mention the COVID vaccine because I did already, but I already mentioned that one, so I'll take my third one. I'm somebody who cares a lot about genetic disease. That's my training. And it's been frustrating that many genetic diseases seemed out of reach as far as therapy. The very first described genetic disease, sickle cell disease, we've known about for more than 100 years. And not a whole lot of progress had been made until the last few years, with a huge push on information from the genome and developing gene therapy, we now have the ability to cure sickle cell disease with a gene therapy approach that's been approved by FDA by 2 different approaches. And people who have suffered ways that you cannot imagine from a lifetime of sickle cell crises are now walking around without that happening at all and figuring out how to reframe their whole lives. There's thousands of other genetic diseases just waiting for that to be possible, and I think we're going to have a chance to get there with tools like gene therapy, like that CRISPR thing that does gene editing, like all of the ways in which we can deliver gene therapy to the right tissue at the right time. This is going to be an amazing period of the next few years, along with a few other things like neuroscience. The brain is going to get figured out. If you're interested in tracking science, or for young people, if you're interested in becoming part of the scientific community, there could never be a better time. This is just an exhilarating moment to see the progress happen at a pace I never would have dreamed of in my whole career.
Thank you, Dr. Collins.